Today's lecture is about stack depth theory and how stack depth affects your strategy. Now, stack depth is a key metric to poker strategy. It influences how you evaluate hands. It influences the polarity of your betting ranges, optimal bet sizing. And the truth is that most players, myself included, don't really know how to adapt correctly to different SPRs. And when I'm talking about stack depth, I'm not necessarily talking about how much you buy in, and I'm not talking about how much money is on the table per se. What matters strategically is the stack to pot ratio, right? How much money you have behind relative to the size of the pot. So the stack to pot ratio essentially influences everything about the evaluation of different hand classes and what types of strategies you should take. Now, I'm going to start with some fundamental definitions here, just so that everyone watching has an idea of what I'm going to be talking about later on. So SPR is the stack to pot ratio. Again, that's the money behind relative to the size of the pot. Nut potential is the strength of your hand when your draw completes. Now, as we get deeper stacked, the value of the nut potential of a hand increases. That is to say, the value of hitting the nut flush becomes exponentially higher deep stacked than short stacked. And that should be obvious because there's more money that gets to go in later. And therefore, that draw will have higher implied odds. Now, implied odds, of course, are the value you expect to gain on future streets should you outdraw your opponent. And in contrast, we can talk about raw equity. That is to say, the strength of your hand if all players were to simply check down. It's important to understand these fundamentals because these are the main things that change strategically as the SPR changes, as the stack depth changes. So how does stack depth influence your strategy? Well, raw equity tends to become more important at low SPRs, whereas it becomes less important at high SPRs. That is to say, just having any made hand at a low enough SPR is sometimes good enough to just get chips in. But at deeper stacks, it starts to become problematic to have, say, top pair, no kicker, and end up paying off top pair, better kicker, as an example. Stack off ranges. So stack off ranges are essentially how wide or tight you can stack off over one or multiple bet sizes. And this is a function of the SPR. At shorter stacks, there's less money behind, and therefore, after all the money goes in, you're going to call wider compared to deeper stacks where the bet sizes have to be larger and larger, or there'll have to be more and more bets in order to get all the money in. And this is a concept I've talked about before, but essentially, you stack off wider at low SPRs, and you stack off tighter at high SPRs. And yes, this webinar is relevant to all formats. Generally, what I cover is going to be something that you can carry over to spins, MTTs, heads up, sit and goes, cash. I try and keep the theory relevant to most formats, although personally, I do specialize more in cash. But for the purpose of this lecture, you can apply it everywhere. So we've talked about nut potential. That's how valuable your hand is should you make your draw. And nut potential becomes less valuable at short stacks because even if you do make your draw, there's only so much money that can go in afterwards. Whereas it becomes more valuable deeper stacked because, of course, your implied odds are higher. Now, implied odds are one of the things that changes the most, of course, at shorter stacks. Low implied odds. You'll have lower implied odds because there's less money behind, and also lower reverse implied odds. So getting in with top pair, it's very difficult to fold top pair at low SPRs. But deeper, as I said, top pair, no kicker can become more of a problem. And so there's higher implied odds for your draws, but also higher reverse implied odds. For example, if you hit your draw and they have a better draw, or if you hit a strong hand and they have a better strong hand. So that's why nut potential becomes a larger part of your decision, deeper stacked, and less important, shorter stacked. Lastly, the positional advantage tends to increase as stacks get deeper and decrease as stacks get shorter. It tends to increase with the log of the pot. That is to say, as you get deeper and deeper, the advantage it grants to the in-position player tends to get smaller and smaller. So let's look at positional advantage a little bit. This graph was taken from a heads up experiment I ran maybe a year ago. Essentially, it's just heads up cash, no rake, and the effective stack anywhere between 50 and 300 big blinds. And we can see that the in positions player, their EV increases as we increase the stack depth. So we can say the positional advantage is magnified as stacks get deeper. And in general, late position is going to be able to open wider as stacks get deeper, as more hands become profitable to play in position. Next, I just want to touch on the concept of pot geometry. So pot geometry, just a fancy word for the geometric bet size. So betting the same percentage on each street to get stacks in by the river. This lecture won't really talk too much about the geometric bet size, but it's important to understand that as you get deeper, in order to get all the money in over 3 streets, for example, you'll need to bet larger. And so we can use this metric to kind of determine, for example, approximate stack off ranges or how much equity you'll need to stack off with, right? Now, essentially, if you give one player a perfectly polarized range, a geometric betting strategy is going to maximize how much money villain puts into the pot while also getting all the money in by the river. In practice, it's a little more complicated. There are non-geometric strategies, bet small on flop, over bet turn, jam river. But regardless, we can use this to kind of determine roughly how wide people need to defend at different stack depths. And so this chart was actually taken from another one of my lectures. So, for example, a 200 big blind single raise pot, the SPR is quite high. That is to say, there's a lot of money behind relative to the pot. And so if you approximate the stack off range over, for example, 1 to 3 bets, just based on MDF, they're going to have to stack off very tight because the amount of betting that has to happen and the size of the bets are so big that the final call down range is extremely tight. And therefore, only the most nutted hands can really get all the money in for value, right? If your opponent is only defending something like 5% of their range by the river, 5% of the range they started with on the flop per se, then by the river, you're going to need a very, very strong set of hands in order to extract value from that. So this is why nut potential increases as stacks get deeper. Now, for example, if we look at a low SPR situation, so we can look at, for example, a 4-bet pot, here the stack to pot ratio is much lower, right? 1.7, 1.3. There's maybe 2 bets behind, 3 bets if you bet small. And in these cases, the stack off ranges are much wider, simply because there's less money behind. And so this is why a lot of coaches will say that people tend to drastically under defend, for example, in position in like a 3-bet pot or 4-bet pot, for example, simply because how wide you have to defend is always a function of the SPR. And at these really low SPRs, you really do have to defend quite a wide part of your range. Now, again, this is just based on some toy game math. It's not going to be like this for every single spot, right? Adam Harris asks, but the starting range is very tight for bet pot. Yeah. And so is the defending range, right? Depending on what you're looking at. So as a function of the ranges that go post flop, when the SPR is quite low, you still have to defend quite wide. Like you couldn't get away with defending 5% of your range with an SPR of 1, for example. That's not going to make any sense, right? You'll just be drastically overfolding. Villain could just, for example, shove everything and you'd end up folding most of your range. So always important to keep in mind the stack to pot ratio and how that correlates with how wide you need to defend. Again, this doesn't have to be cash. You can look at this in heads up MTT. You can look at this in spins, everything, right? It's always about stack and pot, the SPR. So something else I'd like to chat about is the efficient jam principle. Now, this is kind of a term I made up, but I don't really know how else this would be described. So it needed some sort of terminology. Essentially, shoving is a pretty serious weapon in Hold'em. And the reason is that hands that shove always realize their equity, and the person that shoves first gets the last laugh. So solvers will often choose sizes that attempt to avoid giving their opponent a good price on the shove, or alternatively, setting themselves up for a good price on a shove. The essential idea is that, for example, at shorter stacks, what will typically happen is it's going to min open, and if it 3-bets, it's either going to 3-bet to a very small size or it's going to jam. And if jamming isn't really something it can do with a good part of its value range, it might split. So I'm going to show you some examples of the efficient jam principle in action across different formats. And this applies pre and post flop. So we'll go take a look at some examples, pre-flop strategies, 3-betting polarity, post-flop comparisons, and so on. So let's go take a look at a few different spots. So let's start with, for example, a 50 big blind cash spot. We'll go button opens, action on big blind, and big blind raises 10. Now, in this spot, you can see it doesn't even have the option for a smaller bet. It simply jams, right? Of course, you could raise to 20, but the problem is that it's very close to pot committing. In fact, let me go to 75. I think it's going to be a better example what I'm talking about here. Yeah. So 75 big blinds deep, button opens, big blind 3-bets, action on button. Now, something you'll notice is that at low SPRs, these premium hands tend to trap a lot more, and this is common to MTTs as well. But essentially, it's jamming with the more vulnerable part of its 4-betting range. For example, tens, jacks, ace queen, ace king. These hands tend to do better getting the money in immediately, whereas the more valuable premium hands, for example, queens, kings, aces, ace king suited, ace queen suited, these hands are going for a min raise. It wouldn't make a lot of sense to, for example, raise to 30 big blinds here, because if you do that, you're putting in too much money and you have to over defend your range versus a shove. So instead, it wants to use a very small raise. And so the people who ran this solve gave it either a shove or a very small 4-bet, such that we're trying to not give villain a fantastic price on a shove, and we don't have to over defend our range. If you were to use 30 big blinds, what will end up happening, for example, is the button has to use a lot more pocket pairs. It has to call a lot wider versus a shove, simply because the amount of money you've already committed is more. And the size of their 5-bet shove is smaller relative to the pot. And so in order to make the correct bluff to value ratios, what ends up happening is a min raise becomes most effective. Now let's look at the same spot a little bit deeper. We'll go to 100 big blinds. So button opens, action on big blind. This time they've 3-bet larger. You can see it's 27 this time. And again, the more vulnerable hands are going to be shoving, whereas the rest of these are going to 27. And here we'll continue this up. Let's go up to 200 big blinds now. Button opens. The preferred 3-bet size actually gets just a little bit smaller out of position. And now we can see that the 4-bet size has gone up to 38 big blinds. 38, right? A lot of people, if they haven't studied deep stack, they're going to be a little bit flabbergasted by this massive 4-bet, right? But if you think about it, the reason you use, if you're used to, for example, 100 big blinds as a cash player, the reason that you use like something like a 25 big blind 4-bet is simply because you're constrained by the stack depth, right? It's only 100 big blinds behind. Whereas at 200 big blinds, you have a lot more room to play a more polarizing, more natural, for example, pot-sized raise, without overcommitting relative to the stack depth. Does this still apply if your opponent is short stacked? Good question, Jackson. So what we're always concerned about is what we call the effective stack depth. So if you have 1,000 big blinds and your head's up in a pot with an opponent that has 10 big blinds, you are playing 10 big blinds effective, right? So we're always looking at the amount of money that can be risked and then comparing that to the size of the pot. So let's go take a look at this one here. Something else, again, that is related to efficient jam principle is that in both cash and MTT and spins is that you tend to open smaller when the effective stack is lower. So for example, if cutoff opens, there's a very good chance that their opponent will shove if they face a continue. And so the most efficient strategy, if you expect your opponents to shove a lot, is to open for the smallest size possible, which is a min open in this case, right? The other big thing that changes is that at shorter stack depths, this is 20 big blinds effective, by the way, the opening range of hands tends to shift towards more high card equity. So this is a cutoff spot. And as we can see, we're opening a 7 off, we're opening lots of high card equity. And as we go through it, for example, this is 40 big blinds effective. We're going to see that it starts to shift to more hands that do better at deeper stacks. So for example, more pocket pairs, suited connectors, fewer of these dominated ace-X hands, 75 big blinds, 100 big blinds, 150 big blinds, 200 big blinds. Raphael says, blockers of the shoving range. Yeah, that's very important as well. Trying to block that shoving range is important. Poi asks, If positions are reversed, do we still keep the small 4-bet? Generally, the size of the 4-bet is going to be relative to the size of the pot, even if you're out of position, but it does come down somewhat to the polarity. So I'm going to run through this one more time here. There's 20 big blinds. Now pay attention to how the shape of the range changes as we get deeper. 40, 50, 75, 100, 150, 200. And we can see we need more robust equity, as Raphael says. We need hands that, for example, these hands are going to do better in a deeper stacked pot because these hands rely on making big draws in order to justify opening them, right? They get most of their money from implied odds. Whereas, for example, ace-7 offsuit here, this hand mostly is going to make its money from just making top pair, right? You're not making any big draws with ace-7 offsuit. And so as you get deeper, you want to shift your range construction towards different types of hands. And something else to note is that the cutoff gets to open wider as we go deeper. For example, we went from 26 to 30, I think. And that's largely just because more hands are profitable to play in position. Joe asks, why is polarity more important deeper stacked? Is it because you can stack off wider, shorter stacked? Yeah, exactly. We'll get to that shortly, actually. So let's take a look at this spot next. Again, cash game. Now we're looking at post flop. And here we've got Queen Jack 5. And I've compared this spot button versus big blind from 20 to 200 big blinds deep. And something, I've got this here open in the equity distribution graph. Now, one thing to note is that the ranges do change. So as we get deeper, the equity distribution graph tends to get tighter and tighter simply because the ranges have changed. But something else that happens is that as we get deeper, we can start using overbets and start using a more polarized strategy. Here at 20 big blinds deep, it's not going to make a whole lot of sense to start overbetting, right? The SPR is only 4. So typically in MTTs, in short stack cash, in 3-bet pots, anywhere where the SPR is relatively low, you usually stretch it out over 3 streets. And in order to do that, you need to start with a smaller size, right? Here, for example, it's just betting the minimum as the most common. Now, as we start to get deeper and deeper, example, this is 75, 100 big blinds. You can start to use a more polarizing overbet size on a flop like this, right? Raphael asks, we always focus on our nutted hands. They will want to stack off, right? Right. And so in a situation like this, you're going to have enough nutted hands on, for example, Queen Jack 5, that the button wants to get all the money in by the river. Now, if you're 20 big blinds deep, or if the SPR is, for example, 4, like we saw in the first one there, you don't need a big size to get all the money in by the river. You can bet the minimum on the flop, make a medium bet on turn, medium bet on river, and you're going to get stacks in, right? Whereas when the SPR gets deeper, well, a min bet's going to be a little bit harder to get it in. So I've talked about the mechanics of C-bet sizing in another one of my videos. I won't get too much into it here. But essentially, as you get deeper, there becomes more opportunity for large overbet sizes, large check raises, and more aggressive strategies. The larger the sizes that are used, the more polarized you can play. And of course, you can also put high equity draws into here as well. All right, so this one is ace-7-6 monotone. Something else that changes is that we've talked about how the in-position player generally is going to have more of an advantage. And what this means is that the out-of-position player needs to trap more. They need to put more effort into defending their range. So they can't play as aggressively unless, of course, they can shove. So for example, this one is button versus big blind, ace-7-6 monotone. Button has bet third pot. Action is on us. So here we're 20 big blinds effective, and it's raising 11.3%. But as we get deeper, it's going to raise less and less. So here's 40 big blinds. It's raising 8%. 50 big blinds, 7.6. 75 big blinds, it's raising 7.1, 100 big blinds, 150, 200 big blinds. And so we see this interesting pattern where big blind can check raise less frequently as we get deeper and deeper, because essentially their calling range needs to be able to defend against more pressure, right? Their calling range can essentially, 200 big blinds deep, can just face massive overbets over and over and over again. And so because it needs to defend against more pressure, you can't raise as much. And similarly, your check raising range is also problematic because playing a check raise deep stacked out of position is going to be tricky on a very dynamic board like this. All right, so this one is heads up. Very simple. We're just looking at how big blind's 3-bet changes in response to our opening size. So here we're 20 big blinds deep, right? And we can see the 20 big blinds deep, they can only open something like 72% of hands. And big blind mainly 3-bets using a shoving range, right? However, the nutted portion of their 3-bet range, or at least the value portion, for example, aces, kings, queens, jacks, tens, ace, king, these hands are raising smaller. Whereas a lot of the rest of it, for example, these lower pocket pairs and ace-x hands, they're simply shoving. They're trying to get the money in now, immediately, because these hands have, these are what we'll call, for example, high raw equity hands, but hands with poor implied odds. So these hands, if they do 3-bet, would prefer to simply shove. Now, of course, it does need to balance it with different types of hands here as well. For example, ace-6 suited is shoving, and that's because these types of hands actually retain their equity reasonably well against the range of hands that call. Joe asks, should you lean towards stacking off with high equity draws when you are short stacked in an MTT, or would you rather check back in position to try and realize equity, 50 to 20 big blinds? Yeah, that's a great question, Joe. So typically you're going to want to check high equity draws if your opponent can shove and then push you off that draw. We see this a lot in, for example, cash game 4-bet pots or MTT situations where you're in that 20 to 30 mid-stack range and someone has bet reasonably large on the flop. You don't want, the worst possible situation is you bet, for example, a flush draw or a straight draw or a combo draw, your opponent shoves just over pot and now you don't have pot odds to call, right? That's the absolute worst situation. Or alternatively, you do have pot odds to call, but your EV is just terrible. You're indifferent. That's a bad situation. So oftentimes what solvers will do is they will check back high equity draws in situations like that, where the opponent can potentially shove for a reasonable size and push them off their equity. And so that's why I say those types of draws often can be thought of as showdown value hands when the SPR is low. Yeah, Justin says happens a lot in 3-bet pots on the turn after flop bet. Yeah, exactly. Like that's a good cash game example. 3-bet pot on the turn, you'll often end up checking back high equity draws simply because the value of retaining your implied odds is going to be better than betting immediately and potentially getting shoved on. So those high equity draws can play more as a medium strength hand in that sense. So here we can see, for example, 40 big blinds deep, you're going to get the 3-bets are going to be leaning towards more offsuit stuff and a lot of pocket pairs. And we can see that the more vulnerable pocket pairs, for example, 2s, 3s, 4s, 5s, these have reasonable equity as a shove, believe it or not, just because in position has to call with enough worse hands, right? And so what ends up happening is the most vulnerable types of high equity hands tend to shove if they can, if they're getting a reasonable price, whereas the more valuable hands, again, will tend to bet smaller. And as we increase the stack depth, the 3-betting range leans less towards these offsuit blockerish type hands, and it's going to lean more towards hands with better playability. And we're going to get something that is going to become a little more familiar. So here's 60, 80, 100 big blinds, 150, and 200. And as we can see, like 200 big blinds, obviously you can't just go and shove pocket 2s, right? So what ends up happening is you lean more towards nutted hands and hands that can make high value draws. For example, these suited connectors, suited gappers, for example, and proportionally, you're going to get less of these offsuit hands in range, although they are still there at a frequency. Less hands dominate as well. Yeah, that's right. So let's talk a little bit about limping premiums. All right, so here we've got MTT spot. It is 10 big blinds effective, and it has folded to small blind. Now, a lot of people, when they reach, for example, 10 big blinds in an MTT, they're just going to shove or fold. And I'm not saying that's not a fine strategy. Of course, we have no limp solutions as well as limp solutions. And so when it folds to small blind, we can see that, for example, even though it's not allowed to limp, it's still attempting to do something near the same strategy. That is to say, it wants to limp a polarized range containing some nutted hands, some reasonable equity hands, and some trash. And if it is allowed to limp small blind again, their limping range is somewhat polarized towards these very high value hands and very low value hands. Right? Maybe that's easier to picture like this. The limping range contains high EV hands and low EV hands, whereas the opening range, the shoving range, is more condensed. And sometimes that can be a little confusing, like why would you polarize your slow plays and then depolarize your fast plays? And again, this just has to do with realizing your equity. And so, for example, ace 2 is going to do much better if it can realize all of its equity immediately, as opposed to, trying to draw. And again, if you limp here, what ends up happening is, because you're depolarized, if you face a shove, you've got a very easy fold with the bottom of your range and a very easy call with the top of your range. Now, some people are like, okay, well, limp calling queen 7 suited seems insane. But again, guys, this is like blind versus blind. So ranges are ultra wide, right? And this effect of limping premium hands, it extends further than just this one wacky spot. So for example, here's button limping jacks through aces. Here's low jack doing the same thing. And as you can see, the limping range is still quite polarized. So let's take a look at maybe a deeper stacked spot. We could go to 30 big blinds here, for example. And here it's going to stop limping, at least in early position. So why do we think this is? Alex asks, seems like solver prefers 3-betting hands preflop with more nutted qualities deep to have more polarization post-flop. Yeah, spot on, Alex. Very well said. You said it better than me. And so I think it's important that when you're deeper, you should be able to polarize better. So you want to be able to flop more nutted hands, more nutted draws, nutted qualities, as you say, in order to play a more polarized strategy deep stack. You don't want to be, for example, deep stacked with a whole bunch of top pair no kicker type of hands that just struggle to improve. Deep stacked, you want hands that can improve more effectively. Well, medium strength hands will often under-realize their equity. Nutted draws and hands with nut potential will over-realize their equity deep stacked. And so here's maybe another example. Here we have button open, big blind has 3-bet. And again, they 3-bet relatively small because it's only 30 big blinds effective. So they make it from 2 to 8. If this were deeper, you would see the big blind 3-bet much larger, but they don't want to give button a great price on a shove. So the hands that do 3-bet to a small size go here. So they 3-bet to 8.2. And as we can see, a lot of these premium nutted hands, queens, kings, aces, they're just calling, right? They're not shoving. And this can feel very strange, especially to cash game players. Like, why on earth are you calling with pocket queens here? But the truth is that your calling range, you could put more traps in there when you're shorter stacked. Whereas if we were much deeper, it's going to trap significantly less often. And maybe this is a bad example. Now we can see the premium hands are 3-betting more often. And if you change this over to, for example, cash, where there's rake considered as well, again, there's a little bit of trapping with ace-ace and less here. Raphael says, a lot of poker is about realizing and pushing equity. Very well said. Very well said. So what do I have here? Oh yeah, the deep stack triple barrel. This one's kind of a fun one. Deep stacked triple barrel math. So actually, I should mention this beforehand. The entire June daily doses are all about stack depth and how strategy changes. And so all of these quizzes, they start with really short stacks, and the month progressively gets deeper and deeper. So if you're looking to learn a little bit more after this, maybe go try out some of these quizzes. Some are better than others, and you can test yourself a few different things. So here's the one I made for deep stack triple barrel math. So this is a 200 big blind cash game. Big blind versus button, 3-bet pots, big blind triple barrels on flop turn river, under the gun calls down. The board runs out ace, king, deuce, 7, 8. If under the gun starts with 4.5% flushes in the flop, never raises, what percentage of their final call down range will be a flush by the river? And the reason I like this question is simply because it's very mathematical. I can just calculate it. And a lot of poker is quite intuitive and not so well defined, but this question is. So I've got the spot open here. I guess I might have given away the answer there, but go ahead and take a guess. Again, it's big blind versus under the gun 3-bet pot and triple barrel shove on this monotone flop. What percentage of under the gun's final calling range will be a flush by the river? Take a guess in the chat. Vicky says 35%. Raphael's guessing 10. Someone else got a guess in there? 50%, 50%. Yeah, this one's kind of funky. So the way you'd solve this, the answer is 25%. The way you can solve this one is just by simply using MDF. So firstly, in position isn't really going to be raising a whole lot at any point throughout this tree. So they retain all of their flushes from flop to showdown. They started with 4.5%. And so the way to calculate this is just to calculate the minimum defense frequency on each street, multiply those out. So about 18% of their starting range. And so under the gun's final starting range is only 18%. Under the gun's final range is only 18% of their starting range, sorry. And so you end up with 25% flushes. Something else to take note is that the ace and the king remove most of the flushes from the range. So let me take a look here. So here, actually it's 4.3% flushes, but close enough. And something else to keep in mind about 3-bet pots is that oftentimes, especially when the 3-bet was large, you're going to have fewer flushes or flush draws in range because you're going to have proportionally more pocket pairs relative to the amount of suited hands in range, right? And so despite it being monotone, there's not that many flushes in range to start with. So big blind c-bets, 2/3 pot. They c-bet again, 2/3 pot. And they c-bet again on the river, full pot. They call, and we can see the amount of flushes goes to 25%. And this speaks to the stack off ranges as you get deeper and deeper. Something that you started with at 4.5% of your range can quickly balloon up to, 25% of your range. And this is a spot like, yeah, we're 200 big blinds deep, but the SPR isn't that big. It's just 2/3 pot. Imagine what happens when it's overbet, check raise, shove, right? It's even tighter and a very small portion of your nutted hands becomes just a huge portion of the final calling range, simply because the amount of hands that need to defend against larger and larger sizes and more bets becomes less and less. That's why nut advantage becomes more important at deeper stack depths, because as a function of the hands that stack off, they become a larger and larger portion of the range because it gets tighter and tighter, right? you can start with, for example, 2% sets. And then if you're only calling 3% of your range, by the time all the money has gone in, that is to say 3% of your initial flop range, well, all of a sudden you're 2/3 sets by the time you stack off, right? So always keep in mind that the nut advantage is going to dictate sizing, polarity, and the implied odds of your nutted hands is going to increase drastically as the stacks get deeper. In conclusion, stack depth is a fundamental metric that drives your strategic incentives. The SPR influences how much money you can put in, which affects the value of implied odds, stack off ranges, nut potential, and the polarity of your betting ranges. In general, you're going to end up trapping more when stacks are shorter because it's very easy to get money in later. If you watched Wacko's coaching, his previous one, you'll have seen that, for example, in 3-bet pots, in position tends to slow play sets more often, simply because it's very easy to get the money in later. There's not a whole lot of incentive to shove now. Whereas at deeper stacks, those nutted hands need to build the pot. Similarly, in short stack MTT scenarios, a lot of the nutted hands will simply call a raise or they'll limp in, for example. And so another function of this is that your incentive to build the pot with nutted hands changes as stacks are short or deep. And the types of ranges you build, the polarity of those ranges change as stacks get shorter and deeper. Now, a lot of people, they'll just think about, for example, this hand has many possible draws, but they won't think about the nut potential of those draws. For example, if you have a combo draw that's either going to complete bottom straight or a baby flush, that is not a very, like, that hand maybe has a lot of outs to draw to a reasonable hand, but it's not super nutted because if you get a flush, it's a baby flush. And if you get a straight, it's the bottom straight. And so there's a difference between how many outs your hand has to complete a draw and the nut potential of that hand. Similarly, as you get deep stacked, the things like set over set, for example, become much more problematic. People, they don't normally account for how much tighter the final stack off range gets as the SPR gets bigger and bigger. So the other main thing to keep in mind is that regardless if you're pre or post, what ends up happening is the solver is often going to use sizes that will try and allow it to get stacks in by the river if it has enough of a nut advantage. And at short stacks, that's not really an issue. If you're on the flop, you can often use just a minimum bet size in a low SPR situation, and then, like a half pot bet turn and river. Or if you're pre-flop and the SPR is low enough, you can even just 3-bet shove, for example. Anyway, I think I'll wrap it up here, guys. Thank you all for coming. We'll call it a day here, and happy grinding. Thanks all so much.